Okay, so today I'd like to talk about multiplying and dividing integers. I just want to remind you of one of the rules that you need to recognize here is this symbol here, the subtraction symbol, or the minus symbol, or the opposite symbol. That symbol actually can change a number. And so, for example, if I take the number 3, which is right here on the number line, and if I put a negative sign in front of 3, what's going to happen with that is it's going to cause that 3 to go to the other side, and it's going to become the opposite, which is going to be negative 3. This property of this symbol meaning the opposite is we're going to use this when we are multiplying and dividing integers. Okay, so remembering that rule about the symbol meaning the opposite, I want to discuss what happens here. Discussing multiplication and division are really the same operation, and so we can actually deal with these together. And so I'm going to just discuss them under the idea of multiplication, but all of the rules of multiplication also apply to division. So I'm going to begin with the first thing, is which if I multiply a positive times a positive, there's no opposites happening here. Therefore, you're going to end up with a positive number. The second scenario that you can have is if I multiply a negative number times a negative number. Well, what happens here? If we think about this meaning opposite, when I multiply a negative times a negative, that is going to be the opposite of a negative, which is also going to be a positive number. The third scenario I want to discuss is when I have a positive number and I multiply it times a negative number. In essence, what I'm saying here is I'm asking you to find the opposite of a negative number. The opposite of a positive number. The opposite of a positive number is a negative number. And the last scenario I have is if I multiply a negative number times a positive number. Just like the scenario before, if I ask you to take the opposite of a positive, then a negative and a positive will also give me a negative. What I want you to notice is that there's two scenarios here. If the sign is the same, this has the same sign. So it was either plus plus or minus minus. That same sign is going to give me a positive value. The second set of scenario here is when the signs are different. And so when the signs are different, then you're going to actually end up with a negative value. For example, one positive and one negative. Okay, so I want to start off by looking at 3 multiplication examples, and then I'll give you a couple of division examples as well. If I take a look at this first example here, I've got negative 3 times 5. The very first thing I want to determine is whether or not my answer is actually going to be positive or negative. And so I notice here that I have a negative and I have a positive. Therefore, I'm going to ask what is the opposite of the positive number. Therefore, my answer is going to be negative. The next thing I need to do is I need to multiply. I can multiply the 3 times the 5 and I end up with a 15. Scenario number 2, I have a negative times a negative. You'll notice here that I have a negative 4 times a negative 6, and in which a negative times a negative really means what is the opposite of a negative. The opposite of a negative is a positive, and I can put this plus out here if I'd like, or I can just simply leave it blank. I'm going to have a plus out here for this scenario. Once I've figured out the sign, now I can multiply out 4 times 6, and that's going to give me 24. Positive 24. The last scenario that I have is that I have a positive 8 times a negative 2. Once again, I have a positive times a negative. That is the opposite of a positive, which is going to actually give me a negative, and 8 times 2 is going to give me 16. Okay, so I'm going to end on these 2 last division problems here, just reminding you that division can be written many different ways. I'm going to write out the 2 ways that we normally see it. In this scenario here, the top scenario, things have been written horizontally, in other words, from left to right. And so I have a negative 30 divided by 5. So in this scenario here, just like with multiplication, I have one negative and I have one positive. Therefore, my negative, I'm really asking what is the opposite of a positive number, which is going to be negative. Once I've determined that the sign is negative, all I need to do now is determine how many times does 5 go into 30? And I can say 30 divided by 5 is 6. Therefore, my answer is negative 6. The last scenario that I'll talk about in this video is I've got a negative divided by a negative. I have negative 21 divided by negative 3. In other words, I have a negative divided by a negative, or I can think of it as the opposite of a negative. The opposite of a negative is going to be positive. In this scenario, I'm going to leave the plus sign off, as we do so often, and I'm just going to simply divide 21 divided by 3, which is going to be 7. I hope that this video helped you out with multiplying and dividing integers. Have a great day.